The term Anua or Anunnaki indicates a group of gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon dating back thousands of years. For some researchers, the Anunnaki were much more than myth. They were real pre-human beings who constructed many of the ancient sites in the world. A number of these ancient sites, such as Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, are thought by some to be gateways to other worlds and parallel universes, which can only be accessed by those who know. The Anunnaki. Sumer was an ancient civilization located in the Mesopotamia region of the Fertile Crescent, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This region is known today as the Middle East, but in antiquity, Mesopotamia also included parts of Southwest Asia and land around the eastern Mediterranean Sea. Sumer was first settled by people from 4500 to 4000 BC, though it is possible and indeed likely that some settlers arrived much earlier. The Sumerian language is the oldest written language in existence and is first attested about 3100 BC in southern Mesopotamia. In ancient Sumerian texts, Anuna, Akkadian, Anunnaki, describes the highest gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, but confusingly, it can also be used to design the pantheon of a particular city or city-state, such as the Anua of Eridu, for example. One of the main duties of the Anunnaki was to decide the fates, as can be seen in the Sumerian myth Enki and the world order. Enki, the king of the Abzu, justly praises himself in his majesty. My father, the king of heaven and earth, made me famous in heaven and earth. My elder brother, the king of all the lands, gathered up all the divine powers and placed them in my hand. I brought the arts and crafts from the Ekur, the house of Enlil, to my Abzu in Eridu. I am the good seaman, begotten by a wild bull. I am firstborn of An. I am a great storm rising over the great earth. I am the great lord of the land. I am the principal among all rulers, the father of all foreign lands. I am the big brother of the gods. I bring prosperity to perfection. I am the seal keeper of heaven and earth. I am the wisdom and understanding of all the foreign lands. With An the king on An's dais, I oversee justice. With Enlil looking out over the lands, I decree good destinies. He has placed in my hands the decreeing of fates in this place where the sun rises. I am cherished by Nintud. I am named with a good name by Nin Husaija. I am the leader of the Anuna gods. I was firstborn, son of holy An. Although they are usually attested in literary and mythological texts, the Anunnaki are sometimes invoked in curse formulas and also appear in incantations. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, an epic poem from ancient Mesopotamia and the second oldest religious text after the pyramid texts, the phrase Judge of the Anunnaki is mentioned as the title of Gilgamesh. This could be reference to Gilgamesh's function as a judge in the underworld. Zecharia Sitchin. According to author Zecharia Sitchin, whose theories were compiled into his 7 books known as the Earth Chronicles, there is a 12th planet beyond Neptune known as Nibiru that reaches our inner solar system once every 3,600 years. Sitchin believes that an advanced race of human-like extraterrestrials, which he calls the Anunnaki, live on Nibiru and are no less than the missing link in Homo sapiens evolution. The blurb for Sitchin's 2015 book, The Anunnaki Chronicles, a Zecharia Sitchin reader states, "What if the tales from the Old Testament and other ancient writings, such as those from Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, and Greece, were not myths or allegory, but accounts of actual historical events?" Drawing both widespread interest and criticism, Sitchin's Earth Chronicles series of books, beginning with the 12th planet, detailed how humanity arose after the arrival of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, alien gods who created modern man in their own image and imparted gifts of civilizing knowledge. If his theories are true, as Sitchin wholeheartedly believed, then this collection presents some of the most important knowledge we have of our origins and future. Other researchers such as Michael Cremo and Eric von Daniken have argued along with Sitchin that the Anunnaki were aliens posing as gods who genetically engineered the human race, a slave species. What the evidence is for this extreme theory, however, has never been put forward. Göbekli Tepe. Located 6 miles from the ancient city of Urfa in the southeastern Anatolia region of Turkey, Göbekli Tepe is considered to be one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The discovery of this stunning 10,000-year-old site in the 1990s sent shockwaves through the archaeological world and beyond, with some researchers even claiming it as the site of the biblical Garden of Eden. The many examples of sculptures and megalithic architecture that make up what is the world's earliest temple at the site predate pottery, metallurgy, the invention of writing and the wheel, and the beginning of agriculture. That hunter-gatherer peoples could organize the construction of such a complex site as far back as 10 or 11,000 years ago not only revolutionizes our understanding of hunter-gatherer culture, but also poses serious challenges to the orthodox view of the rise of civilization. There have been one or two alternative suggestions which question the conventional timeline of Göbekli Tepe, however. A summary of British author Andrew Collins' 2014 book, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, the Temple of the Watchers and the Discovery of Eden, on the publisher's website makes some astonishing claims. Collins explores how Göbekli Tepe was built as a reaction to a global cataclysm, the Great Flood in the Bible, and explains how it served as a gateway and map to the sky world, the place of first creation, reached via a bright star in the constellation of Cygnus. He reveals those behind its construction as the Watchers of the Book of Enoch and the Anunnaki gods of Sumerian tradition. Unveiling Göbekli Tepe's foundational role in the rise of civilization, Collins shows how it's connected to humanity's creation of the Garden of Eden and secrets Adam passed to his son Seth, the founder of an angelic race called the Sethites. In his search for Adam's legendary cave of treasures, the author discovers the Garden of Eden and the remains of the Tree of Life, in the same sacred region where Göbekli Tepe is being uncovered today. Ancient sites as gateways to other worlds. But Collins is not alone in claiming that ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe acted as gateways to other dimensions. The Hell or Hades of the ancient classical world was supposedly located at the Cape Matapan caves on the southernmost tip of the Greek mainland. Cape Matapan, also known as Cape Teneron or Tenero, was the place where Orpheus traveled down to Hades to rescue Eurydice, and where Hercules made his own descent to the underworld and brought Cerberus, the multi-headed dog that guards the gates of the underworld, to the surface. A mysterious chasm known as Lacus Curtius, located in the heart of the ancient Roman Forum, was also believed to be a gateway to hell. The name indicates that it was a lake, and archaeologists believe that in ancient times there was a lake on the site of the later Roman Forum. There are various stories of ritual sacrifice and offerings surrounding the site. It was once believed that at the beginning of a new reign, a chasm would suddenly open in the middle of the Forum Valley, which could be closed, according to priests, by human sacrifice. Pluto's Gate, or Plutonian in Greek, is located at the World Heritage Site of Hierapolis in southwestern Turkey, which was discovered as recently as 2013 when archaeologists followed the route of a thermal spring. The remains, which the archaeologists recovered, matched closely with ancient descriptions of the temple to the underworld on the site that disappeared mysteriously in the 6th century AD. The Greek geographer, philosopher, and traveller Strabo, who lived from 64 BC to 24 AD, described the site when he visited. This space is full of vapour so misty and dense that one can scarcely see the ground. Any animals that pass inside meets an instant death. I threw in sparrows, and they immediately breathed their last and fell. Among other artifacts at the site, the archaeologists discovered an inscription with a dedication to the deities of the underworld, Pluto and Kor. They also found the remains of a temple, a pool, and a series of steps built above the cave, all fitting the descriptions of the site in ancient sources. There are numerous other myths describing such entrance places to the underworld all over the world. Could these ancient sites have somehow retained in myth form their function as gateways to other realms?
Followers of scholar and author Zecharia Sitchin know that the many names of the gods and goddesses of the various empires throughout ancient history were actually the same pantheon of gods revealed in the tens of thousands of clay tablets discovered in the ruins of the royal library of Ashurbanipal in the Assyrian city of Nineveh, dating back to the 7th century BC. Convenience of the populace, they were gods to the people they mastered, but in fact they were a small group of very real visitors of an advanced race called the Anunnaki. These were the ones who started the Sumerian civilization and later the Assyrian, Egyptian, Persian, Hittite, Akkadian, Indian, Chinese, pre-Inca, Toltec, Mayan and Olmec civilizations. How could the Anunnaki have been known by and have interacted with all these various civilizations over a very long period of history? The answer to this is that they had an extremely long lifespan compared to ours. Exactly how long was never revealed, but the texts indicate that their lifespans changed while they were living on Earth. At least one, Marduk, died a natural death. His body was preserved with oils and encased in a coffin in Babylon. His body was viewed by Alexander the Great in 331 BC. As indicated by the tablets, his lifespan on Earth would have been around 331,000 years. This video, however, is not aimed at convincing you of the existence of these visitors to our world. Zecharia Sitchin spent a lifetime studying this ancient enigma and wrote 14 books explaining his research. This video is meant to try to shed light on one aspect touched on very little by Sitchin or any other researchers of this ancient puzzle. It is a question that continued to haunt me after spending so much time understanding his work, which carefully explained how this small group, for good or for bad, helped jump-start humanity and civilization around the world. I say small group because the tablets tell us that there were only 600 at the height of their occupation, and that they were led by two brothers, Enlil and Enki, and their offspring. These two were the supreme leaders on earth, assisted by their sons and daughters, known by their worshippers as gods and goddesses. Enlil was given the title of Lord of the Command, while Enki was Lord of the Earth. In our terms, these titles would equate to Mission Commander and Senior Scientist. For this short video, we cannot go into the entire story as explained in Sitchin's 14 books, so I will focus on only two aspects. First, the various names by which these visitors from the two families were known in the various civilizations. I did not put together this list by happenstance, but as a result of a thorough personal research project, beginning with Sitchin's discoveries and following on with studies of available translations of ancient writings, scholarly books, and similar depictions of mostly ancient stone carvings. The second aspect is how the Norse gods of supposed mythology fit into the Anunnaki puzzle of ancient mankind. Visitors were treated as absolute gods by all humanity with whom they came into contact. They taught their knowledge to the various civilizations, sometimes for their own benefit, and sometimes for the benefit and self-sustainment of their worshippers. Each civilization gave them their own names, but they were single individuals who lived over a long span of time. The creation of civilizations, the ties to the gods of the various civilizations, have been researched and written about by many in addition to Sitchin. The megalithic temples, pyramids, fortresses, and even the early cities across the planet, which to this day cannot be explained by traditional archaeologists, engineers, or scholarly historians, are testament to the gods' existence. The one mythology which has had little attention or effort to tie it back to the Anunnaki is that of the Norse gods. The story of the Anunnaki, as explained by the tablets, can be followed in a logical timeline which follows the progression of the civilizations as they grew into their own periods. The beginning, as is accepted by archaeologists and scholars, is the Sumerian civilization of Mesopotamia. This was the civilization that documented the name Anunnaki, which means those who from heaven to earth came. What the scholars will not admit, though, is that there is no earthly explanation for the meteoric rise of mankind from barely surviving hunter-gatherers to a thriving civilization with advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, writing, music, poetry, agriculture, animal husbandry, engineering, public administration and government. In evolutionary terms, this rise happened overnight. As humanity's population grew and spread out across the planet, the Anunnaki offspring from the original two leaders, Enki and Enlil, also grew. The Anunnaki Senior Council, headed by Anu, decided to grant lordships to their offspring in new areas. Enlil became the overlord of Asia and Europe, and Enki the overlord of Africa. The Sinai and the lands of what is now Israel were handed over to Ninmah, one of the two sisters of Enlil and Enki. The new lands of West and South America, now known as Bolivia and Peru, became the province of Enlil and his sons, while the northern and eastern areas of Central America, Mexico including the Yucatan, became the province of Enki and his sons. Enlil's son, Marduk, took over Egypt from his brother Ningishida, who then took some of his followers to the Central American region. Marduk became known as the Egyptian god Ra, Ningishida became known as Kukulkan to the Mayans, and Quetzalcoatl to the Toltecs, and later the Aztecs. Their mission of the Anunnaki, as it had been from the beginning, was to gather gold for removal to their home world. To do this they needed the manpower provided by humanity. In order to use the manpower they needed to ensure that the masses could sustain themselves, thus they imparted knowledge to help accomplish their end goals. In the meantime they were worshipped by their followers for the great powers they possessed. They assigned kings to manage the people and priests and priestesses to impart the knowledge and guide the people on how to worship and provide for the deity's every wish. The mission begins to fall apart, unfortunately. The Anunnaki's mission also brought warfare upon mankind. Warfare, as documented in many ancient writings, including the Bible's Old Testament, in most cases was ordered by the gods. Some of the Anunnaki offspring were not satisfied with the realms they'd been given, and decided to expand their empires into other realms through the capture of territory, causing bad blood between the two clans and massive wars. The main instigator of this bad blood was Enki's son Marduk. To make matters worse, Marduk decided to marry a female human. Up to this point, sexual relations and interactions with the human women was strictly forbidden. The wedding announcement went out far and wide to include the Anunnaki workers, who were designated to provide off-world support in transporting gold and supplies. This group was described as 300 strong and given the title Igigi, those who observe and see. 200 Igigi were invited down to earth for the grand wedding. Enlil was incensed by the blatant disregard by Marduk for their strict rules, but an even more dire consequence came from Marduk's rebellious actions. The announcement stoked a long-held suspicion and resentment in the Igigi that this had been going on for a long time. That resentment was that they were being left out of tasting the forbidden delights of the female humans. Prior to this, the Igigi were allowed to take their shore leave, so to speak, on Earth at Baalbek in what is now Lebanon, but were not allowed to mingle with the humans. So the Igigi devised a plan that when they came for the wedding, they instead would go out and take female humans for themselves. If this sounds like a fantasy, you will find that it is described in the Old Testament, most of which came directly from the ancient writings of the tablets. Genesis 6 verses 1 to 2 reads, "When humankind began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful. Thus they took wives for themselves, from any they chose." Enlil was enraged by this traitorous act, and banished the Igigi for their actions. Again from the Bible, Genesis 6 verse 3 reads, "So the Lord said, My spirit will not remain in humankind indefinitely, since they are mortal. They will remain for 120 more years." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after this, when the sons of God were having sexual relations with the daughters of humankind, who gave birth to their children. They were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. So the Igigi in the Sumerian texts were the Nephilim in the Bible. The Igigi, now banished by Enlil, became followers of Marduk and Enki. Why the northern regions? Now we need to jump to why the Anunnaki ended up in the northern regions. Among the continuing strife between the clans, as if a forerunner to Romeo and Juliet, Inanna, the granddaughter of Enlil and a powerful goddess in her own right, fell in love with one of Enki's sons, Dumuzi. They were married sometime around 3100 BC. Marduk opposed this marriage because he hated Enlil and his whole side of the family. In his mind they stood in his way of becoming the single most powerful ruler on earth, which he believed was his right. Marduk was so enraged by the marriage that he devised a plan to destroy it through planned seduction and betrayal. The plan worked so well that Dumuzi panicked and ran away in the dark. He slipped and fell on some rocks, killing himself in a freak accident. This started a long and bitter war between Inanna and Marduk, which ended in Marduk's near death and final exile by a council of the Anunnaki. The texts do not say where he went during his exile, but during this time he was known by the Egyptians as Amun-Ra, the unseen Ra. We know from the texts where he could not go because many parts of the earth had been divided up. The places taken at the time were areas around the Mediterranean, Africa, Mesopotamia, Persia, India, and Central and South America. A hint is given in the translations by Sitchin in the Lost Book of Enki. With Sarpanet and Nabu to a land of no return he departed. To a place where horned beasts are hunted with wife and son he went. So I believe that what happened is Enki took his son Marduk and the Igigi followers with their spouses to northern Europe and the Scandinavian lands. Enki became Odin and Marduk became Thor of Norse mythology. The Igigi became all the other gods and goddesses in Norse mythology, numbering in the hundreds. Norse mythology compared with Sumerian texts. Norse mythology is a collection of beliefs and stories shared by northern Germanic tribes in what is mostly now Scandinavia. The mythology was orally transmitted in the form of prose, a loose storytelling poetry which helped them remember the stories before the adoption of writing. Our knowledge about it is mainly based on the medieval texts written down during and after Christianization of the area. Nothing else was ever written into documents. The Prose Edda is one of the two Old Norse compilations put together in Iceland in the early 13th century. It can be gathered from the prose that there were considered to be slightly fewer than 300 gods and goddesses worshipped by the ancient Norse people in what is now Scandinavia. The description of the chief god, Odin, fits almost exactly the Sumerian description of Enki. Odin was a seeker and giver of wisdom, fitting well with Enki the scientist. Enki became Odin and Marduk became Thor of Norse mythology. The Igigi became all the other gods and goddesses in Norse mythology, numbering in the hundreds. Norse mythology compared with Sumerian texts. Norse mythology is a collection of beliefs and stories shared by northern Germanic tribes in what is mostly now Scandinavia. The mythology was orally transmitted in the form of prose, a loose storytelling poetry which helped them remember the stories before the adoption of writing. Our knowledge about it is mainly based on the medieval texts written down during and after Christianization of the area. Nothing else was ever written into documents. The Prose Edda is one of the two Old Norse compilations put together in Iceland in the early 13th century. It can be gathered from the prose that there were considered to be slightly fewer than 300 gods and goddesses worshipped by the ancient Norse people in what is now Scandinavia. The description of the chief god, Odin, fits almost exactly the Sumerian description of Enki. Odin was a seeker and giver of wisdom, fitting well with Enki the scientist. There were two god tribes, the Aesir and the Vanir, and Odin was the father, god, of the Aesir. These tribes sound much like the Anunnaki and the Igigi castes. The prose indicates that the two tribes quarrelled and warred with each other. There is precedence in this from the Sumerian-Assyrian tablets. The story is complicated, but there was bad blood between Marduk and some of the Igigi due to an internal rivalry between two Igigi brothers who married two of Marduk's daughters. One brother ended up killing the other in jealousy over his rise to prominence under Marduk. It was a true family catastrophe, and laid the lines for both Igigi and Marduk followers to take sides and hold bitter resentments. Although the two stories, Norse and Sumerian, of the causes of bad blood are somewhat different, the similarity is that in both stories the underlying cause is a goddess wife spreading suspicion and strife in support of her own rise to power. This could well explain the stories of the Aesir and Vanir tribes of gods quarrelling and warring in later times. According to the Norse prose, eventually the divinities became weary of fighting and decided to call a truce. Thor was the eldest son of Odin, which is the correct lineage of Marduk. Thor is described as the personification of thunder and the principal war god, much like Marduk, especially in later periods after his return to Egypt. He was said to have a tendency to act first and think later, which often got him into trouble, another similar tendency to Marduk. What is interesting from the prose is the story of Balder, Odin's son, who was married to Nanna, very close to the name Inanna. As with Dumuzi, Balder also died in the Norse legends. His description of being friendly, wise, eloquent, and gracious also fits with the Sumerian-Assyrian descriptions of Dumuzi. Apart from this description, Balder is known primarily for the story of his death, which was also caused by mischief, but was not attributed to Thor, who would have been the mischief-maker Marduk. Instead it was attributed to a mischief-maker, Loki. In many ways Loki seems to represent the ugly side of Marduk. The other son, Hermod, the messenger god, appears to represent Ningishida. Very little is mentioned of Hermod in the Norse prose, which would make sense because Ningishida spent his time developing the Mesoamerican Olmec, Mayan, and Toltec civilizations during this period of exile for Marduk. Finally, there is Tyr, the fourth son of Odin, which appears to equate with Enki's fourth son, Nergal. In the Sumerian Akkadian texts, Nergal is also the first to choose war as the solution. The prose Edda tells a story of when the gods tried to bind their evil nemesis, the wolf Fenrir, with a magic rope. The wolf refused to allow the rope to be put around him unless one of the gods put his hand in the wolf's mouth as a pledge of loyalty. Tyr was the brave one to put his hand in the beast's mouth, and when the beast found himself caught, he took off Tyr's hand. Nergal was somewhat of a turncoat to Marduk in the Sumerian texts. He was wed to Enlil's granddaughter, Inanna, and took sides with the Enlilites. He formed an alliance with Inanna during the war with Marduk, helping to defeat Marduk and send him into exile. It is interesting how the Norse god Tyr is depicted with a story that seems to be an allegory for how Marduk, Thor, may have wanted to depict his turncoat brother. When you consider that the Anunnaki deity, Nergal, took sides with the Enlil clan in the wars against Marduk, you can see how this might well be an allegorical story to represent how the brother was fooled by the beast and paid for it. This also brings forward the question of whether the beast, Fenrir, was an allegorical representation of Enlil. Fenrir was a giant wolf raised by the Aesir gods in order to keep him under their control and prevent him from wreaking havoc throughout the gods' 9 worlds. The gods learned of a prophecy which foretold that the wolf and his family would one day be responsible for the destruction of the gods' worlds. They caught the wolf and locked him in a magic rope. The prophecy said that on the day of Ragnarok, doom of the gods, Fenrir would break free and join the giants in their battle against the gods. He would seek out Odin and devour him. This sounds very much like an allegorical story of the constant chess-like battle between Marduk and Enlil for supreme power over all the lands, and that Enlil's way will bring destruction and the end of the gods' reign over earth. Norse mythology indicates that Odin had 2 brothers, Vili and Ve. Some sources use their names, Honir and Loda. They are credited with making the earth and also with creating humans. After making the earth, the 3 brothers came across 2 logs, which they used to create man and woman. Odin gave them breath and life. Villa gave them brains and feelings, and Ve gave them hearing and sight. Vili, or Nir, may represent Enlil, but in Sumerian texts There is no second brother of Enki. Scholars have variously identified Ve, Loda, with Loki and Freya, but consensus has not been reached on any one theory. Apart from his role in giving hearing and sight to the first man and woman, he is hardly ever mentioned. The story of Odin's creation of the first man and woman fits well with the story of humanity's creation in the Sumerian texts. However, instead of a story of logs, the tablets go into great detail about Enki's genetic manipulation and experimentation, which involved combining some of the Anunnaki's own DNA with the DNA of the Homo erectus ancestors found in southeastern Africa. Although this took an extremely long time to perfect, it explains completely the unexplainable evolutionary jump in mankind from simple creatures to the Sumerian civilization, practically overnight in evolutionary terms. In this way, Enki, Odin, did in fact give life and breath to the first man and woman. Enlil, on the other hand, commanded the cities of the Sumerian civilization. He organized the teaching of all the knowledge to pass on to the new humanity. This was out of necessity as much as for the benefit of the Anunnaki. They had to teach a growing population how to take care of itself. Thus he assigned teachers for all the necessities of a growing civilization. In essence, he was the one who gave them, as the Norse creation story expressed, brains and feelings. Physical evidence. So what hard physical evidence do we have that it might have been the Anunnaki who were behind the Norse legends? One thing that the Anunnaki left behind, wherever they went, were megalithic astronomical calendars. They are found all over the world. Sitchin went into great detail in his book, When Time Began, as to the purpose of these calendars, which most often were solar and lunar. In Sweden we find just such an ancient megalithic astronomical calendar, Alastenar, Eil's stones. Ancient Scandinavians dragged 59 boulders to a seaside cliff near what is now the Swedish fishing village of Kasaberga. They carefully arranged the massive stones, each weighing up to 4,000 pounds, approximately 1,800 kilograms, in the outline of a 220-foot long, 67 meters long, ship overlooking the Baltic Sea. Researchers believe that it was built as an astronomical calendar with the same underlying geometry as England's Stonehenge, which is now accepted by the archaeological community to be a solunar calendar. Interestingly, organic remains and stone tools associated with Stonehenge indicate that construction began sometime between 2900 and 2600 BC. The date selected by British authorities is 2800 BC. Niels Axel Mørner, retired head of the University of Stockholm's Paleogeophysics and Geodynamics department, stated this about Alastenar. It is an astronomical calendar. Stone hollows are perfectly aligned after sunrise and sunset. It is statistically impossible that this was a coincidence. Carbon-14 dating from organic remains has provided 7 results from the site. One result indicates that the material is around 5,500 years old, whereas the remaining 6 results indicate an age of about 1,400 years. The deviance of the accuracy was not reported, but generally there could be as much as 500 to 800 years variance in a place of this climate. The 5,500-year-old period is very close to the time indicated for the exile of Marduk. Using the date of the most carbon-14 results of a group, as has been reported, has endemic problems which have not been considered by the academic community. That is, the structure obviously has had activity around it, leading all the way up to current times. Carbon-14 dating of the oldest artifacts should be considered the best possibility of ascertaining the original age, not the least. Another interesting item is the picture stone from Labro, Tangelgada, at the Swedish Museum of National Antiquities, which is considered to be a depiction of Odin and his sons marching to war. The stone was probably created in the 7th century and based on oral stories that were passed down. The most interesting aspect of the picture, though, are the power rings being held in their hands. These are the same power rings depicted in ancient Persian and Sumerian carvings of their Anunnaki gods. Return to Egypt. It is unknown how long Marduk remained in exile, but at some point before 2000 BC he was pardoned by the supreme leader Anu when he was on a state visit. During the visit, Anu was taken to see the ongoing progress at the gold, tin and copper works in the Peruvian Andes next to Lake Titicaca. While there he had second thoughts about the exile and requested that Marduk be brought before him. According to the tablets as translated by Zechariah Sitchin in the Lost Book of Enki, from lands from the north, lands where great horned beasts are hunted, Marduk before his father Enki and his grandfather Anu came. Nabu his son with him was. The references to the north and great horned beasts support the position that Marduk was exiled to the northern European region of Scandinavia, where the large red deer and elk are so plentiful. Anu took pity on Marduk and pardoned him for his transgressions, which allowed him to resume his position as a living god over Egypt. Evidence indicates that on his return the Igigi who had followed him to the harsh northern regions also followed him back, leaving the Norse stories of the gods to become mythology. The end of the gods' time on earth. Marduk essentially returned to his previous ways of conquering new lands and fighting against the Enlil clan for more and more power. The wars continued and even worsened, but there came a time when everyone had had enough. After calamitous wars, Enlil came to accept that destiny was conquering all. Marduk eventually won out to get what he wanted, the position of supreme ruler. He set himself up in Babylon, which he had built. The Igigi followers were present for his inauguration, supporting the proposition that they followed him back out of the northern regions. Enlil and his clan left to complete their work in the lands beyond the sea. This refers to the metallurgy works of what is now known as Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, alongside Lake Titicaca, Bolivia. Eventually the order went out for all to leave Earth completely. According to Sitchin's calculations, this happened over a period between 610 and 560 BC. Conclusion. Evidence points to the Norse mythology as one more case of the presence of the Anunnaki during the beginning of mankind's jump into a knowledge-based civilization. What started as an exile for transgressions against their own kind became the beginning of the pre-Viking and northern Germanic tribes' existence with the living gods. The period of their occupation in the Scandinavian lands cannot be exactly determined, but it most likely happened during an extended stay in the mid-2nd millennium BC, and probably lasted for many hundreds of years. They likely used allegorical fantasy-like tales to explain their seemingly magical powers to their worshippers, and these stories were passed down in poetic storytelling form before writing could be utilized. When the exile in Scandinavia ended, they left, never to return, leaving behind only the tales of their presence.
The Vikings were one of the most mysterious and brutal groups known in history. They kept few historical records, but passed down their tales of battle and bravery through oral traditions. Legends of Viking artifacts, Norse gods, and horrific methods of torture still intrigue modern minds today. One of the most mysterious legends in the Vikings is the existence of the elusive sunstone. The stone has been mentioned in countless stories, passed down through generations. It's believed that seafaring Vikings would have used the stone to guide them on their voyages. To this day, we don't know precisely how this stone would have worked. While roaming the seas, the Vikings likely used several methods of navigation. Some researchers believe Vikings would have used the sun, as well as the paths of migratory animals such as birds or whales, to guide their way. These animals most likely would have helped guide them to Iceland, Greenland, and as far as North America. Though recent discoveries also suggest that they may have also used sundials or other rudimentary inventions to navigate. But none of these methods have captured the interest of Viking researchers as much as the sunstone. The original stories of this mystical stone date back to the reign of Norwegian King Olav II. The many stories about the stone suggest that it would have harbored some sort of magical power. However, it's possible that the stone may have simply been some sort of crystal used to manipulate light. One theory claims that the stone could have been a special cut of calcite crystal. In modern times, replicas of these crystals have become popular for their ability to split light into several wavelengths, creating a rainbow effect. If this is true, the Vikings may have used the sun's rays and the color spectrum to guide themselves around the ocean when there was no land in sight. This may also explain why people throughout history thought the stone was magical. To primitive people, the properties of the sunstone seemed impossible to explain. This could be where the stories of the mysterious sunstone originated. People simply couldn't understand how light could be projected from a stone in such an incredible way. Maybe the mysterious sunstone is not so mysterious after all. The weapons of the Vikings are legendary. One particular style of sword, known as the ulfberts, was especially unique. The craftsmanship applied to these weapons was hundreds of years ahead of its time. The privilege of having such a sword belonged exclusively to the elite. Because an ulfbert's sword, unparalleled strength, could only be had at high cost. The sharpness and durability of the blade made it possible to cut through bone or a lower quality weapon with one blow. The quality of these swords was so remarkable that other societies would not be able to forge such a weapon until over 700 years later. Scientists have been mystified as to where these swords were created until recently, when new information became available. A previous theory held that the swords may have their origins in the Middle East or Asia, but surprisingly, it seems that the materials were sourced closer to where they were found, in Central Europe. A sword found in 2012 was studied for its chemical composition, and it was revealed that this sword had a high manganese content, which implied that it didn't come from the East. The guard was made of iron with a high arsenic content, which suggests it may have originated from a European deposit. The pommel was covered with a sheet of tin-lead alloy. It was determined that the pommel plate lead had come from a site in the Taunus region just north of Frankfurt, Germany. The lead would not have likely been mined and transported elsewhere for processing, since the deposit was already largely depleted in Roman times. This suggests that the sword was forged close to the source, bringing researchers one step closer to the elusive Ulfbert sword. In addition to being known for their sea voyaging and advanced weaponry, the Vikings were infamous for their brutality. One particular infamous method of punishment is the blood eagle, a glory ritual Vikings are said to have performed on their most loathed enemies. The ritual involved carving the victim's back open and cutting their ribs away from the spine before the lungs were ripped out through the wounds. The fluttering of the lungs splayed out on the outspread ribs would supposedly resemble the movement of a bird's wings, giving the horrific practice its name. For years, researchers have dismissed the blood eagle as a legend. As the Vikings themselves kept no record, no archaeological evidence of the ritual has ever been found. However, the Vikings passed down their history via oral tradition in spoken poetry, stories and songs. Legends of the blood eagle have been dismissed by researchers as improbable and the reflection of Christian writers' desire to portray their Viking attackers as barbaric. However, one team of researchers has taken a new approach to the study of this mysterious ritual. A team made up of medical scientists and a historian bypassed the long-standing question of, did the blood eagle ever happen, and instead posed the question, could it have been done? Their answer was a resounding yes. Using modern knowledge of anatomy and physiology, along with a thorough reassessment of the 9 medieval accounts of the ritual, the researchers studied what effect a blood eagle would have had on the human body. What they discovered was that even with the technology of the Viking era, the procedure itself would be difficult but not impossible to perform. The team studied 9 medieval accounts of the Blood Eagle ritual and discovered that barbed or lugged Viking spearheads could have unzipped the rib cage quickly from the back. The researchers stated if the Blood Eagle ritual was ever actually performed, it was reserved as a demonstration of elite power in the Viking Age. The whole affair of cutting bones and removing organs would have been a blood-soaked gore-fest. However, the victims' screams would have silenced soon after the soft tissue was stripped from their backs, an event which the scientists said would have been audible over a significant distance. The brutality of this elite ritual seems to be in alignment with the character of this violent cultural group. The researchers also said Viking rulers had no qualms about displaying the dead bodies of humans and animals in special rituals, including during spectacular executions. The Vikings routinely used fear to establish dominance, and the scientists concluded that the anatomical realities of the Blood Eagle make it clear that the procedure would be attention-grabbing, to say the least. So what happened to this brutal and powerful culture? According to Welsh historian Gwyn Jones, the Viking Age did not end suddenly. The downfall was the result of a combination of factors, principally a string of debilitating defeats in battle and the rise of Christianity. Between 950 to 1050 AD, Christianity experienced rapid growth in Europe. Christians went from being targeted by Scandinavian Vikings to successfully converting the villagers from the religion of Norse paganism to the faith of Jesus Christ. The result was a complete transformation of the region because, according to Jones, nothing was more characteristic of the northern lands than the Old Norse religion. The Norse worldview slowly faded from the region with every new convert. Many of the new Viking converts were baptized, and some eventually rose to leadership positions in their local churches. Many Vikings adopted biblical values and a new way of life in accordance with the teachings of the gospel. The disappearance of the Vikings can also be attributed to the decline of slavery. Years of raiding and killing their European neighbors created a lack of people to take back to their homeland to enslave. The Viking Scandinavian farms relied on forced labor to function. Without this labor pool, Viking sons were forced to remain home and do more work on family farms. The Viking way of life was proving to be unsustainable. Christianity also preached that the slave trade was immoral. As Vikings converted to Christianity, the practice of slavery diminished. So after centuries of pillaging, torturing, and murder, you could say the Vikings simply settled down to a quiet, Christian, agrarian life. Maybe they got tired and just didn't have much fight left in them after all that violence. By the 13th century, the Viking way of life was practically non-existent, and for that, we can literally thank Jesus. The 13th century BC witnessed the zenith of many Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean civilizations, such as the Mycenaeans in Greece and the Hittites of what is now Turkey and Syria. However, these civilizations declined and disappeared at the end of the Bronze Age around 3,000 years ago. For many, this collapse was caused by the mysterious Sea Peoples. The only contemporary source for these Sea Peoples are inscriptions describing 2 Egyptian military campaigns. The first of these campaigns was by the Merneptah, who ruled from 1213 to 1203 BC against the Libyans, who, with the help of northerners coming from all lands, also referred to as peoples of the countries of the sea, were attempting to move into the western delta. 3 or 4 decades later, Pharaoh Ramesses III, who reigned from around 1186 to 1155 BC, fought against another wave of these invaders moving south from Syria. Ramesses commemorated the campaign on his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Luxor, where he referred to his antagonists as invaders from the foreign countries. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu date to the year of Ramesses III's reign, at about 1190 BC. The texts are extremely significant as they provide an account of Egypt's campaign against these invaders from an Egyptian point of view, and the artistic depictions of the Sea Peoples give important information about the appearance of weapons of the various groups. One inscription from the site states, "Now the northern countries, which were in their isles, were quivering in their bodies. They penetrated the channels of the Nile's mouths. Their nostrils have ceased to function, so that their desire to breathe the breath. His Majesty has gone forth like a whirlwind against them, fighting on the battlefield like a runner. The dread of him and the terror of him have entered into their bodies. They are capsized and overwhelmed in their places. Their hearts are taken away, their soul is flown away, their weapons are scattered by the sea. The Phoenicians are known today for their development of the alphabet, their cedar-built ships, fine purple cloth, and their trading cities in Lebanon, Carthage, and Tyre. The Phoenician culture emerged around 1550 BC in a narrow coastal strip of land which is now Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Israel, and became the great maritime traders of the ancient world. By 700 BC, they had expanded to dominate the Mediterranean area, establishing emporiums and colonies from Cyprus in the east to the Aegean Sea, Italy, the coast of north of Africa, and the Atlantic coast of Spain in the west. However, invasions of their homeland by the Persians in 539 BC and Alexander the Great 200 years later sent their civilization into decline. The Phoenician civilization was organized in city-states which generally occupied strategically important sites along the Mediterranean coast and soon became important trading centers, establishing trade networks with Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and Babylonia. Many of these cities, Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, had been Canaanite settlements, and there is no reason to believe there was any cultural break between the Canaanites and Phoenicians in the area. However, around 1200 BC, an unknown event occurred in the region which caused a general collapse. This is historically connected with an invasion from the north by a group known as the Sea Peoples. Mycenaean Greece, circa 1600 BC to 1100 BC, consisted of a series of independent city-states centered on palaces, and the most important of which was Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese, the home of the semi-legendary Agamemnon, one of the leaders of the Greek army which defeated Troy. Each Mycenaean city was autonomous, ruled by a king, and protected by considerable fortifications. At their height, the Mycenaeans controlled all of Greece and the Aegean from the separate city-states. The Sea Peoples are believed by some to have caused the downfall of the Mycenaean civilizations at the end of the Bronze Age, during which all Mycenaean palaces, except those on the Acropolis of Athens, were destroyed. Although human agency was certainly involved, as many of the palaces were burnt to the ground, whether the Sea Peoples were responsible for all of this or just part of a more widespread unrest is not clear. Some researchers have suggested that the Mycenaeans later formed all or part of the Sea Peoples, perhaps together with groups of Phoenicians becoming essentially pirates roaming the eastern Mediterranean. Whoever these people were and whatever happened around 1200 BC, the power of the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks and other civilizations in the area was considerably weakened, and the whole of the Mediterranean world entered a period of economic and political instability which will still last for hundreds of years. It is during this volatile period that many Phoenician cities began to develop into significant maritime powers, perhaps due to the power vacuum left by the decline of the major Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures of the time. The ethnic makeup of the Sea Peoples has long been a matter for heated debate. Over the years, it has been believed by various researchers to have included Etruscans, Trojans, Sardinians, Philistines, Minoans from Crete, and of course, Atlanteans. In his 2008 book, Bronze Age Atlantis, the International Nautical Empire of the Sea Peoples, author Walter Backum posits a link between the Sea Peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean and the lost civilization of Atlantis. An advertisement for his book sums up his theory, stating, Walt Backum merits the Empire of Atlantis as having initiated the Bronze Age. He also sees Atlantis as being a cultural and trading bridge between the American continents and Europe. He identifies the Sea Peoples who attacked Egypt in the 1200 BCE as offshoots from the inhabitants of Atlantis. Although the title would seem to imply romantic fantasy, the book is a serious work about the confederation of two major peoples and their search for the metals that gave them almost complete control of the Bronze Age for 1,000 years. It rethinks the sensationalized and romanticized version of Plato's Atlantis, with proof after proof of the identities and commercial enterprises of those ancient master mariners. It clearly shows that the story as told by the Egyptian priest Solon, who brought it back to Greece, was derived from original records contained in ancient Egyptian temple inscriptions and papyrus texts. The book further identifies the most reasonable location of the capital city of Atlantis, the correct time and extent of its oceanic empire, and the reason for its collapse in 1200 BCE. Scholars of Eastern Mediterranean prehistory have been waiting with barely concealed excitement for 13 years for Bakun's solid evidence for his extreme theories. He has yet to provide any. Although some researchers believe that the Sea Peoples were a real confederacy of seafaring raiders, many think that rather than being interpreted as one cultural group, the term is best understood as referring to a number of population movements by various groups around 1200 BC. In other words, they were a symptom of the collapse, not the cause. The origins and identity of these roving groups, however, is still obscure. However, a recent DNA study of ancient human remains from the city of Ashkelon on the coastal plain 12 miles or so north of Gaza, in what is now Israel, has provided some fascinating, significant results in terms of the identity of the Sea Peoples. The abstract of the article, which appeared in the journal Science Advances in July 2019, makes interesting reading. It says, the ancient Mediterranean port city of Ashkelon, identified as Philistine during the Iron Age, underwent a marked cultural change between the Late Bronze and the Early Iron Age. It has long been debated whether this change was driven by a substantial movement of people, possibly linked to a larger migration of the so-called Sea Peoples. Here we report genome-wide data of 10 Bronze and Iron Age individuals from Ashkelon. We find that the early Iron Age population was genetically distinct due to a European-related admixture. This genetic signal is no longer detectable in the later Iron Age population. Our results support that a migration event occurred during the Bronze to Iron Age transition in Ashkelon, but it did not leave a long-lasting genetic signature. Hopefully, this is just the first of many DNA studies of the ancient populations of the Eastern Mediterranean, which will soon shed some much-needed light on the mysterious Sea Peoples. The nation of Peru has an incredibly rich history that goes far back into the mists of time and features what is thought to be the oldest civilization in the Americas, the Norte Chico, as well as the later Inca Empire, the largest and most technologically advanced civilization in the pre-Columbian era. Tools have been unearthed in the region that date back to 11,000 years ago, and evidence of nomadic and agricultural settlements has been found that suggests Peru has housed myriads of civilizations since at least 6,000 BCE. Peru's long and varied past holds many intriguing mysteries, and while some are fairly widely known, others are more obscure. Perhaps the best known of all Peru's ancient enigmas are the famous Nazca lines, a series of geoglyphs carved into the bedrock of the Nazca Desert in southern Peru sometime between 500 BCE and 500 CE. These formations, some of which are nearly a mile across, consist of several different geometric shapes, as well as more than 6 figures that represent plants and animals. Proponents of the ancient aliens hypothesis have long pointed to the Nazca lines as evidence that ancient cultures were visited by extraterrestrials who imparted technological knowledge to them, and that the lines themselves were carved there to serve as landing strips of a sort. While it is true that the geoglyphs are best appreciated from the air or from high hilltops surrounding the site, most researchers believe that the lines were created as some sort of religious ritual, although their true purpose is still unclear. The Chulpas of Silistani. A chulpa is a tomb or funerary tower built to house the remains of a noble individual or family, much like the pyramids of ancient Egypt. Chulpas can be found throughout Bolivia and Peru, but perhaps the most famous are those located in Silistani, a cemetery constructed by the Kula, a pre-Incan civilization indigenous to southeastern Peru. The towers are constructed in a sort of funnel shape and only have 2 small openings, one at the top and one at the bottom. The openings at the bases of the towers have long fascinated scholars. In fact, because they appear too small for an adult to have passed through them, leading some scholars to surmise that the structures may have been used as grain silos, though the majority of researchers seem to favor the idea that they were indeed used as tombs. There are also beautiful carvings of animals, including pumas and lizards, decorating the perfectly fitted granite blocks that were used to build the towers, and the openings all face east towards the sunrise. The chulpas built by the Kula are considered more architecturally sophisticated than later Incan constructions. Out-of-place artifacts, bronze gears. One captivating and little understood find from Peru are the so-called bronze gears, also known as the Peruvian sun discs. This series of 6 bronze objects was allegedly first described by Professor Rafael Larco Hoyle in the first half of the 20th century, though it is unclear who discovered them. The artifacts believed to predate the Incan Empire are small wheels, 4 of which have distinct teeth around the outer edges, making them look almost exactly like modern mechanical gears. While researchers have hypothesized that the discs may simply be representations of the sun, their eerie resemblance to present-day machine parts has given some observers pause and led a few to wonder if these particular wheels are actually the keys spoken of in some ancient legends that are supposed to open the gate of the gods in the mountains of Hayumaka. The Temple of the Crossed Hands. Peru not only boasts the oldest civilization in the Americas, but also what is possibly the oldest temple, the Temple of the Crossed Hands at Cotoche, an archaeological site in central Peru near Huánuco. The temple is believed to be around 4,000 or 5,000 years old and was discovered in 1960 by Dr. Seiichi Izumi of the University of Tokyo. Though it is mostly a ruin today, it is notable for the unusual stone carvings featuring crossed forearms and hands. This particular iconography reappears throughout other artifacts stemming from the Meito period, the earliest cultural era of the site. The significance of the crossed hands symbol to the people who built the temple is unknown, though some anthropologists have theorized that the hands may represent the duality of man and nature, a common thread running through much of the mythology of the Andean cultures. The mysteries of Machu Picchu and Vilcabamba. Perhaps one of the most iconic architectural sites on the planet, the citadel of Machu Picchu in the Cusco region of Peru, was constructed by the Inca in the mid-15th century, perhaps on the site of an older structure, and likely to serve as a home base for the emperor Pachacuti, who died in 1472. The estate, built using the dry stone method, in other words without the use of mortar, consists of 3 main structures: the Temple of the Sun, the Room of the 3 Windows, and the Intihuatana, a large ritual stone thought to have astronomical or calendrical significance. Only occupied by the Inca for approximately 100 years, as it was abandoned following the conquest by Spaniard Francisco Pizarro and his men. Oddly though, the Spanish conquistadors never discovered Machu Picchu, and in fact the citadel remained largely forgotten, except for the locals, until 1911, when an American historian named Hiram Bingham reintroduced it to the world. While Machu Picchu is sometimes referred to as the lost city of the Incas, this epithet is not entirely accurate, as the true lost city is Vilcabamba, also known as Espiritu Pampa. This city, construction of which began in the 1530s, was founded by Manco Inca Yupanqui, the ruler of the Neo-Inca state, who had once been essentially a puppet emperor placed on the throne by the Spanish. Just as in the case of Machu Picchu, Vilcabamba was lost following the Spanish conquest of 1572 and rediscovered in 1911. All that remains of the fabled lost city of the Incas today are a few dozen stone houses, flat terraces, some pottery, a fountain, and a stone bridge. The Marque Huesi Ruins. On an eerie plateau more than 12,000 feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains stands a bizarre series of rock formations, the origins of which are still in some dispute. The granite stones, some of which are nearly 100 feet tall, appear to be fashioned into recognizable shapes, such as animals, human faces, and other seemingly purposeful symbology. The site also features a few small pre-Columbian ruins and funerary structures along its outer perimeter and is undercut by a system of still unexplored caves and tunnels. The site was first discovered in the 1950s by philosopher and explorer Daniel Russo, and while many experts posit that the rock formations came about due to natural volcanic activity and erosion, others are not so certain and speculate that an ancient, pre-Incan people known as the Masma created the statues about 10,000 years ago using some hitherto unknown method. The ruins at Marque Huesi are also notable in paranormal circles for supposedly being the site of nearly 24 vortices that are said to emit differing types of healing energies. The Amar Karyai face. Another enormous rock formation that is almost certain to have been deliberately carved by members of an ancient civilization is the Amar Karyai face, or Rostro Harikbut, a gargantuan sculpture protruding from a cliff side, deep within the jungles of the Peruvian Amazon. The face was believed to have been sculpted by the Harikbut people, and legends about it are abundant in the region, though it is a difficult site to find, let alone get to. The statue has never been formally investigated by archaeologists, and there is still the slightest possibility that the face may have been formed through natural means, but the lack of other similar stone formations in the area and the fact that the location of the face does not seem to have been subject to any significant erosion from the nearby river lends credence to the idea that the face was deliberately hewn from the rock, though the purpose for undertaking such a task is not known. It's also believed that there may be more carved faces hidden in the surrounding jungles, just waiting to be discovered. Sacsayhuaman. Though the Cusco region of Peru is primarily known as being the site of Machu Picchu, another walled citadel not far away is just as fascinating and perhaps holds even more secrets. Sacsayhuaman is a fortified complex built on a hillside overlooking the city of Cusco. Construction of the citadel is thought to have begun in around 1100 CE. Its builders, the pre-Incan Quilque people, had occupied the area up to 300 years prior to the start of the project. After the Inca took over the site in the 19th century, they added on the complex and incorporated into their cultural mythology, later claiming that the ruler of the kingdom of Cusco, Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, had named Sacsayhuaman the Lion City. Among the archaeological enigmas of Sacsayhuaman are the upside-down stairs, a strange inverted staircase believed to be the result of some unknown cataclysm, such as a devastating earthquake that may have flipped the entire structure completely onto its head. Researchers are still pondering the disaster that must have occurred at the site to account for the chaotic ruin that remains today. The entire construction of the complex at Sacsayhuaman, in fact, is puzzling enough in itself, for the structures were fashioned from massive granite slabs that would have been unbelievably difficult for individuals in a pre-technological civilization to move. Some scholars have put forth the idea that the Quilque, or whoever first built the citadel, may have had some knowledge of a particular plant that softened the stone, making it easier to manipulate. Then again, other researchers claim that the rocks themselves exhibit evidence that they were heated to a very high temperature, a process called vitrification that leaves the stone surfaces as smooth as glass. If this is indeed the case, these scholars argue, then it would mean that the builders may have had some access to a highly advanced tool that got hot enough to melt the rock. In addition, the temple located at Sacsayhuaman has also been said to contain what may be evidence of a type of written language that could be as much as 30,000 years old, predating the accepted oldest written language, Sumerian, by several orders of magnitude. This hypothesis was put forward by author Dr. Derek Cunningham, who argues that the stones comprising the temple were laid out in a specific geometrical configuration that not only suggested intricate knowledge of astronomy, but also served as a sort of alphabet. Dr. Cunningham further stated that the purported astronomical alphabet is very similar to other ancient proto-texts discovered at Paleolithic sites in China and Africa, as well as in the famed Chauvet and Lascaux caves of Europe. The venerable and mysterious cultures of ancient Peru, no doubt, have many more secrets to reveal in the future. There are places on Earth that few humans are able to set foot on. Some of these places are restricted because they are treacherous, so it would be understandable why the general public would be discouraged from visiting. Some places, however, are forbidden for other reasons. One such dangerous place is North Sentinel Island. The island is inhabited by an uncontacted tribe known as the Sentinelese people. The Sentinelese have inhabited this island for the past 30,000 years and have retained their hunter-gatherer way of life, which, while the majority of the world has gone on to embrace industrialization, almost every attempt to make contact with these Sentinelese has ended in disaster, not for the tribe, but for the Westerners bold or foolish enough to trespass on their island. The most recent casualty of the Sentinelese was a young American who attempted to contact the islanders in order to convert them to Christianity. The last time the young man was seen was when the fisherman who dropped him off watched the tribespeople burying his body on the beach. Many people agree with allowing this tribe to continue their way of life undisturbed. The question is, why have world governments, who are not known for minding their own business, respecting the tribe's wish to remain undisturbed? Another island existing in total isolation is completely uninhabited, by the living anyway. Poveglia Island is a small parcel of land in the Venice Lagoon off the eastern coast of northern Italy. The island was once home to a hospital where people infected with bubonic plague were sent to quarantine and either recover or die. The island also became a dumping ground for deceased bodies shipped over on barges from the mainland. Authorities incinerated thousands of bodies on Poveglia Island to prevent further spread of the disease. In the early 20th century, the government repurposed the island and existing facilities as a hospital for the mentally ill. Due to the remoteness, lack of oversight, and perhaps even the sinister energy at work on the island itself, the doctors there began performing gruesome experiments on their patients. One of the doctors, allegedly driven mad by the tormented spirits haunting the island, committed suicide by leaping from the bell tower. The bell was soon after removed from the tower, though decades later, nearby residents have claimed they sometimes hear it ringing. Some of forbidden places on Earth are not off limits to protect visitors, but to protect the place itself. Surtsey Island, a volcanic island located off the southern coast of Iceland, has been protected from the general public since its creation. That's right, since its creation. This infant island was formed by an underwater volcanic eruption in 1963 and was declared a World Heritage Site and Nature Reserve in 1965. Only a handful of scientists are permitted to study on the island. This tiny, pristine landmass is considered a perfect site to observe biological colonization, as plants and animals have slowly started to find their way to Surtsey. Over 90 species of birds call this island home, but since the island will probably sink below sea level within the next 100 years, it's unlikely humans ever will. Lascaux Cave is another World Heritage Site where the general public is prohibited from entering. Lascaux Cave is a Paleolithic cave situated in southwestern France, which houses some of the most famous examples of prehistoric paintings. It was discovered in 1940 by a group of young boys who were examining a foxhole. After widening the entrance, one of the boys slid down the hole to the bottom, and his 3 friends followed soon behind. After exploring on their own for a few days, the boys, eventually excited, told their teacher what they discovered. The process of excavating the cave was set in motion, and by 1948 it was open to the general public. The cave was available for viewing until 1963, after it became apparent that many visitors had caused algae and fungus to grow on the walls, subsequently damaging the historical artwork. Despite the closure, fungi has spread within the cave, and efforts to control this issue and protect the art continue to this day. Right at the intersection of historical significance and mortal danger lies the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. In 1974, a group of farmers digging wells near Xi'an, China, stumbled upon a shocking archaeological discovery. They unearthed a life-size terracotta soldier, which turned out to be one of an army of thousands. Each soldier was unique, with individual clothing, hair, and facial features. For almost 50 years, archaeologists have been excavating the site. So far, they've uncovered over 2,000 clay soldiers, but experts estimate there are more than 8,000 in total. To this day, the central tomb of Qin Shi Huang has yet to be opened, partially out of respect for the over 2,200-year-old emperor, and also due to the deadly rivers of mercury which are said to flow within the caverns. There might come a day where technology will allow scientists to safely excavate the rest of the site, but for now the contents of this ancient tomb remain a mystery. Other places where the general public are not permitted entry are only dangerous because the people with guns who stand watching over them. One of the most famously guarded places in the United States is Fort Knox in Kentucky. Fort Knox has, over the years, served as a secure holding place for some of the United States' most precious historical documents, including the original Bill of Rights and Constitution. During World War II, it was even home to the English crown jewels. Today, it serves as the United States Gold Bullion Reserve, or at least that's what they tell us. Some researchers have suggested that there's no gold in Fort Knox, or at least the amount is greatly exaggerated. In 2011, Senator Ron Paul called for an audit of the gold in Fort Knox, but no outside experts were granted access, and only 5% of the gold was tested. There hasn't been a full audit of the gold at Fort Knox since 1953. Whatever is or isn't being held at Fort Knox is a complete mystery, since there are no visitors allowed in the depository or even near the building. One such top-secret place is not so secret anymore. Area 51, 70 miles north of Las Vegas, Nevada, has been in operation since 1955, but the government only acknowledged its existence in 2013. It has long been rumored that Area 51 is a site where the U.S. government experiments with extraterrestrial technology and perhaps even extraterrestrial beings themselves. Since the public has been made aware of the existence of Area 51, it's likely that the most otherworldly experiments have been moved to a new location, but that doesn't mean the government is welcoming visitors. As recently as 2019, a man was shot dead by government personnel for attempting to enter Area 51. If you ever find yourself in the desert outside of Las Vegas, make sure to obey the posted signs if you value your life. The last and perhaps the most nefarious place we're going to mention is known as Bohemian Grove. It's not a nature reserve, archaeological site, or government base. However, many heads of state have reportedly engaged in activities there. For 2 weeks every summer, the 2,700-acre secured private camp in the ancient redwood forest of Northern California plays host to a selectively invited assortment of the most powerful men in the world. Some notable attendees of this elite gathering have been some U.S. presidents, including Nixon, Eisenhower, Roosevelt, both Bushes, Hoover, Ford, and Reagan. Then other government officials such as Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, Henry Kissinger, and a wide selection of White House chiefs of staff, senators, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, army generals, and more. The Rockefeller family is always in attendance, not to mention elite members of the entertainment industry and corporate world. There have always been rumors surrounding this secret elite summer camp, and some of them are chilling. No one exactly knows what really goes on at Bohemian Grove, because when the attendees are the richest and most powerful men in the world, you can only guess. To join the Bohemian Club, you only need to be invited by a current member, pay $25,000 plus annual fees, and be able to keep a secret. The Maya are probably the most well-known of the classical ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica. It's estimated that they originated in the Yucatan around 2600 BC. rising to prominence around 250 AD in what we now know as southern Mexico, Guatemala, western Honduras, and northern Belize. The history of this ancient culture is both fascinating and macabre due to their belief in offerings of human life for their gods. Blood was viewed as a compelling source of nourishment for the Mayan deities, and the sacrifice or offering of a living creature was a powerful offering to appease them. Unfortunately, when we hear of the Mayan civilization, this is the first thing that comes to our minds. But what about the advanced infrastructure and technological ingenuity of this ancient culture? The fact that the Maya were able to create a remarkable civilization in an environment that is recognized as one of the most hostile and unfavorable in the world has always been something of a mystery. How they were able to survive, let alone flourish, and build a civilization that thrived in excess. What was, and still is, crucial for the success of any community is safe drinking water, and American researchers now believe that indigenous and state-of-the-art water purification systems made from natural materials provided them with just that. Researchers have discovered evidence of a filter system at the Corriental Reservoir, an important source of drinking water for the ancient Maya in what is now northern Guatemala. A multidisciplinary team of anthropologists, geographers, and biologists have identified crystalline quartz and zeolite, which would have had to have been transported from miles outside the city. These compounds create a natural molecular sieve, and both minerals are still used in modern water filtration systems today. The scientists traced the zeolite and quartz to steep ridges around the Bajo de Azua, which is about 18 miles northeast of the city ruins of Tikal. They used X-ray diffraction analysis to identify the minerals in the reservoir sediments. Kenneth Barnett Tankersley, Associate Professor of Anthropology and lead author of these studies, said that this filtration system would have removed harmful microbes, nitrogen-rich compounds, heavy metals such as mercury, and other toxins from the water. What is interesting is this system would still be effective today, and the Maya discovered it more than 2,000 years ago. Tankersley said this would make it one of the oldest water treatment systems of its kind in the world. The Maya civilization is recognized as one of the most dominant indigenous societies of Mesoamerica and Central America, that is, until the conquistadors landed on its shores in the 16th century. Unlike other smaller and scattered indigenous populations, they were centered in one geographical block, and this concentration showed that they remained relatively safe from invasion by other Mesoamerican tribes or populations. A highly advanced civilization, they excelled at agriculture, poetry, hieroglyph writing, calendar making, and mathematics, and to top this off, they left behind what can only be described as some of the most outstanding and impressive examples of architecture and symbolic artwork of the ancient world. Most of their great stone cities were abandoned by 900 AD. However, and for the last couple of centuries, archaeologists and researchers have debated what may have caused this tragic decline. They created small villages on eroded and ridged landscapes, which soon evolved into remarkably huge cities, and what is so impressive is that these areas would only have limited supplies of drinking water. One of their greatest cities, Tikal, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and formerly known to the Maya as Yaxmutal, was an extensive metropolis whose ruins are located in northern Guatemala. It's famous for its steep pyramids, and each year flocks of tourists visit the site trying to get a glimpse into the past. How on earth this once thriving city supported and sustained a large population in such an inhospitable climate, constantly prone to drought, has always perplexed experts. For the ancient Maya, creating ways to collect and store clean, drinkable water was of critical importance. Tikal and other Mayan cities were built on top of porous limestone, which would certainly have made ready access to drinking water nearly impossible to obtain for much of the year during seasonal droughts. Water is one of the few resources which is indispensable for life, and there's evidence of ancient water purification methods dating back as far as 4000 BC. These methods were to improve the taste and look of the water, although there were a lot of bacteria that eluded the methods of the past. Between 4000 BC and 1000 AD, a variety of natural minerals were used to purify drinking water. To disinfect water, many of our ancient cultures would have used copper, iron, or even hot sand in conjunction to boiling. Herbs such as amla, which is high in vitamin C, and kus, were often used in wells for filtration purposes, and plants such as water lily roots and near Mali seeds were also used for purification. In ancient Egypt, aluminium sulfate, iron sulfate, or a mix of both was used to extract suspended solids. A fabric bag, called the Hippocrates sleeve, was used to strain water before it was boiled in ancient Greece. In accordance with the Sanskrit manuscript, the Susrata Samhita, they used sand and gravel to filter before boiling in ancient India. The Susrata Samhita is an ancient Sanskrit text on medicine and surgery and is one of the most important such compositions on these subjects to survive from the ancient world. Unfortunately, ancient civilizations had no knowledge of the dangerous toxins that can grow in water. Pathogens that were tasteless or invisible to the naked eye still managed to get into their bodies and make them sick. Their only way of testing water purity was through its clearness and its taste and smell. The storage of a clean water supply was also something important to be considered in an ancient India container made of brass and copper and zinc alloy, which we used to keep drinking water safe. It's widely acknowledged that certain metals disrupt bacteria cycles, so there was an actual science behind the way it was stored in ancient times. The Romans, Greeks and Mayans all used aqueducts to keep their water pure, but when these ancient cultures fell away, progression of water filtration systems slowed to a halt. There were no advancements made for centuries until Sir Francis Bacon began to experiment with saltwater purification in 1627. He kick-started the research of interest in water filtration, even though his own attempts of removing salt using sand failed. According to the scientific reports section in Nature.com, researchers reported that some reservoirs in Tikal eventually became polluted with harmful levels of mercury, which likely came from a toxic ore of mercury once used as a pigment called cinnabar. This component was used by the Maya on plaster walls and ceremonial burials in the ancient citadel, and is the historic source for the brilliant red or scarlet color we would now call vermilion. Natural sources such as wells and streams can usually be virtually free from particles and contaminants, but water from a river has to be purified and cleaned to make it suitable for human consumption, and of course, this takes a lot of money and manpower. In the USA, around 76 billion gallons of water are pumped from the ground for various uses on a daily basis, including washing cars, bathing, and for industry and so on, which is very sad to see, though, that with all the technological and industrial advancement we have made since the Maya started on the path of water purification, there's an estimated 1.1 billion people out of the 7.8 billion on this planet that still have no access to clean drinking water. Water is an indispensable resource that is necessary to sustain human life. It is a right for every living thing on this planet to have clean drinking water. It's disturbing to think that even with all the money, ingenuity and natural resources available, there's such a large population without this basic necessity. Up until quite recently, the most predominant hypothesis about the earliest settlement of the Americas held that around the time of the last ice age, roughly 13,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers slowly began making their way from eastern Siberia to what is now Alaska via the briefly ice-free corridor as the Beringia land bridge, which opened up approximately 14,800 years ago. From there, these people began to spread southward, the theory asserted, and eventually became what is now referred to as the Clovis culture, who were believed to be the ancestors of all the indigenous people of the Americas. However, beginning in the early 21st century, several other archaeological finds began to systematically chip away at both the Clovis first concept and the idea that the first settlers had walked across the Bering Strait land bridge while following herds of game. Sites situated all around North and South America started to be discovered, which demonstrated that people were living there well before the land bridge opened up, which means they must have arrived on the continent by different means. One of the newest and most intriguing finds suggests that settlers had established camps in what is now known as western Idaho as far back as 16,000 years ago, and possibly even earlier. This was well before the Beringia land bridge was believed to be passable. And what's more, the tools they made looked nothing like the widespread Clovis-type tools found at various sites around the Americas. In fact, according to some researchers, the tools found in Idaho bear a striking resemblance to the tools manufactured by ancient people hailing from a specific region of what is now Japan. The archaeological site known as Cooper's Ferry is located in the Columbia River basin of western Idaho, at the junction of Rock Creek and the lower Salmon River. Beginning in the 1960s, scientists began excavating the site, uncovering deeper and deeper layers of evidence that the area had been occupied for far longer than anyone had ever imagined. According to the oral histories related to archaeologists by members of the Nimipu tribe, now more commonly known as the Nez Perce, the region had once been the site of an ancient village known as Nepihi, but as more exploration of the site was conducted, more and more intriguing evidence began to come to light. Between 2009 and 2018, an expedition led by an Oregon State University professor of anthropology named Lauren Davis dug out a 43 by 23-foot pit at Cooper's Ferry, which yielded a treasure trove of ancient artifacts. Among the finds were more than 24 stone tools, about 160 flakes of rock from tool manufacture, evidence of fire pits, and the bones of an extinct horse, which they assert may have been butchered and cooked on site. One of the most potentially earth-shattering discoveries about the site was the fact that when bone and charcoal from the ancient site fire pit was carbon dated, it revealed that the hearth was between 14 and 15,000 years old, and other pieces of charcoal found in the next layer below, it was carbon dated to nearly 16,000 years old. There was also evidence in higher layers of sediment that the site had been occupied off and on until as recently as 8,000 years ago. Lauren Davis asserted that the camp may have been continuously occupied by settlers all that time, or in a more likely scenario, that Cooper's Ferry might have been a seasonal camp, and that it was used as a temporary base for fishing and hunting parties moving through the area. Using a statistical model, Davis's team determined that, in the aggregate, the artifacts recovered from the Cooper's Ferry expedition were probably between 16,560 and 15,280 years old. Clearly, this is yet another nail in the coffin of the so-called Clovis First hypothesis, since, if the dates from Cooper's Ferry are correct, then that means settlers were in western Idaho about 2,000 years before the breakup of the ice sheets during the Pleistocene that opened up the land bridge in the Bering Strait. Most scientists now agree that the land bridge was only open for a relatively narrow window of time between 14,000 and 14,500 years before the present. But this recent expedition is the only and the latest of a long line of discoveries that have been casting doubt on the conjecture that the Clovis people were the earliest American inhabitants. The Clovis culture was named after a particular type of fluted stone tool, examples of which began to be found in the 1920s and 1930s, alongside various Pleistocene fauna at an archaeological site near Clovis, New Mexico. These distinctive tools, essentially some stone spear tips known as Clovis points, have been dated to around 13,000 years ago, and were manufactured in a very specific way, by carefully removing chips off the edges of the blade with a percussor tool, a method known as bifacial percussion flaking. Clovis points have been found over vast areas of North America, as well as the northern portion of the South American continent, though no Clovis points have been discovered that were produced earlier than about 13,500 years ago. The possibility that the earliest settlers to the Americas walked across a land bridge from Asia goes back all the way to the 16th century, specifically to the writings of Spanish Jesuit priest Fray José de Acosta. In the 19th century, Biologist and geologist Louis Agassiz posited that continents were sometimes covered with ice sheets and glaciers, thus lending credence to the theory that people very well could have arrived in North America on foot as they followed the migration of buffalo and other large game animals. And from the 1930s right through to the early 21st century, it was widely believed that the Clovis culture represented the earliest settlers to the Americas. But then in 2011, news broke of an excavation at a site in Buttermilk Creek, Texas, which produced several thousand stone artifacts which were dated to between 13,200 and 15,500 years old, much older than any of the Clovis sites thus far discovered. And Buttermilk Creek wasn't the only site that was slowly changing our understanding of ancient human migration. There were also the Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon, which contained human coprolites dated to 14,300 years ago, making them the oldest DNA evidence of human habitation in North America that's been found so far. Perhaps even more impressive is Meadowcroft Rock Shelter near Cross Creek in Pennsylvania. At this site, archaeologists unearthed pottery, hand axes, and other artifacts that have been tentatively dated to 19,000 years ago. If this date is accurate, that would make Meadowcroft not only the oldest site of a human presence in the New World, but also the longest span of continuous human occupation on the continent. Another contender for oldest human settlement in North America is Cactus Hill in southeastern Virginia. Artifacts from this site indicate that it was inhabited 16,000 to 20,000 years ago. Similarly, a site called Topper along the Savannah River in South Carolina has yielded artifacts of a similar age, though the age of these finds has been disputed. There is also a sinkhole at a site called Page Ladston in Florida, in which human artifacts and butchered animal bones have been discovered, believed to date from about 14,500 years ago. And amazingly, sites even farther afield have produced even older relics. Perhaps the best evidence site of the many found in South America is Monteverde in southern Chile, which has produced evidence of human habitation as far back as 18,500 years ago. So how did the first settlers get to the Americas, and where did they come from? Since overwhelming evidence now exists to suggest that the Clovis people were not the first to arrive on the American continent, and that humans were living at least as far east as Virginia, and as far south as Chile well before the Beringia ice bridge was open, then how did these first people get here? Most archaeologists posit that settlers must have either skirted the Pacific coast on foot, utilizing a relatively small strip of land that hugged the coast and was hemmed in by glaciers, or perhaps arrived in ancient boats. As an illustration of this theory, evidence of human habitation discovered in Bluefish Caves in Canada's Yukon Territory appears to date from around 24,000 years ago, which seems to imply that settlers were indeed taking a route to North America that roughly corresponded to the Pacific coast. There is also some genetic evidence to suggest that at some point between 17,500 and 14,600 years ago, a population that was living south of the massive ice sheets that collared the northern reaches of the continent began to slowly split off into two separate groups, one of which moved in a generally northerly direction, the other of which moved more towards the south. In fact, the presence of Clovis-style points and butchered bones belonging to a southern bison were found in Charlie Lake Cave in British Columbia and were dated to approximately 12,500 years ago, which would seem to suggest that the Clovis colonists came from the south rather than the north. Though it seems clear that pre-Clovis people arrived on the continent via different means. The Clovis settlers very well may have utilized the later ice-free corridor in the Bering Strait on their travels from the western plains of what is now the United States up into modern-day Canada. The stone tools found at the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho might give a hint as the origin of the people who settled there approximately 16,000 years ago. The spear points recovered from the region are drastically different to the ubiquitous Clovis points manufactured later on. Whereas Clovis tools have a flaked groove or flute at the base, right at the spot where the point would be fitted onto an arrow shaft or spear handle, the tools discovered at Cooper's Ferry have stems on the bottom where the points attach to the weapon. Even though there are some of these spear points that date from around the same time as the Clovis points, it's obvious that they were made by two very different methods, and thus, by extension, made by two differing cultures. The stem method of making projectile points is not at all unique. Examples of similar technology can be found in African and Asian artifacts dating back to 50,000 years ago. However, there are different ways to go about manufacturing such a spear point, and the points discovered in Idaho bear an uncanny resemblance to the points produced in Northeast Asia, specifically on the island of Hokkaido, in what is now Japan. Artifacts from this region span the period from about 13,000 to 16,000 years ago. It's also worth noting that there have also been spear points dating from around 13,500 years ago discovered in East Russia, and though they are also stemmed, they were manufactured in a clearly different style than the examples found at the sites in Hokkaido. This would seem to strengthen the hypothesis that there is a link between the people who lived in that region of Japan at the time and the people who migrated to North America and made camp at Cooper's Ferry long ago, where it's possible that both peoples came up with nearly identical methods for stemming their spear points. This is less likely than the alternative, especially since the dates of the Japanese spear points and the ones found in Idaho line up very well with the proposed scenario. There has, of course, been some dissension about the Japanese migration hypothesis, with some researchers claiming that the tools unearthed at Cooper's Ferry are not as old as they appear, and not as similar to the Japanese points as claimed, might simply be evidence of a later settlement, or might perhaps be an indication that the Beringia land bridge was opened far earlier than previously believed. It has further been pointed out that evidence gleaned from the genetic data and dental anthropology would seem to suggest that Native Americans are not all that genetically similar to people from northern Japan. Though controversy remains about when the earliest settlers arrived and where exactly they might have come from, it seems obvious that ancient peoples began arriving at the Americas many thousands of years earlier than once assumed, and took a far different route than that which was popularly supposed. The Nommo are primordial ancestral spirits in Dogon religion and cosmology, though some researchers are convinced that they may in fact be aliens. In one story of the Dogon of West Africa, an ark descended to the ground, bringing advanced amphibious beings known as the Nommo. These beings gave the Dogon advanced information about an invisible companion to the star Sirius, which was extremely heavy and made of a special metal not found on Earth. It would one day be known to astronomers as Sirius B. The Dogon are an ethnic group of around 600,000 people, most of who live in the rocky hills, mountains and plateaus of the Bandiagra escarpment in the Middle Plateau region of Mali. The ancestors of the Dogon came from the area of Mandi in southwest Mali and northeast Guinea, that was the center of the 13th century Mali Empire. After the collapse of this empire, the Dogon migrated to their current rocky home. The cliffs and difficult terrain where the Dogon settled offered effective protection from raids by slave traders coming from the desert, though they also resulted in the isolation of communities. When Mali became a part of French West Africa in the 1890s, the slave raids ended, and the Dogon were able to expand into the plains around the plateau. Unfortunately, this migration separated the Dogon from their religious sites, making room for Islam and Christianity. But the Dogon are still known for their intricate cosmology and extraordinary rituals that go with it. Their mask dances are now tourist attractions. Indeed, after a mask has been used in these ritualist celebrations, it is no longer considered sacred and is often sold to tourists. Dogon religion is devoted mainly to worshipping the ancestors and the spirits they encountered when they migrated across the western Sudan. For every 60 years, the Dogon perform a religious ceremony called the Sigui, corresponding to the duration of the life of the first Dogon ancestor. The ceremony occurs when the star Sirius appears between two mountain peaks and is celebrated over 7 years, during which time the great mask is carved from a single piece of wood. These masks are incredibly tall and symbolically complex, and their elaborate dance reenacts the creation of the Dogon culture. This and all Dogon ceremonies are organized by members of the Awa, a male initiation society with important ritual and political roles within the Dogon society. Awa society members are also responsible for the creation and performance of the masks, all of which portray the face as a rectangular box with deeply hollowed channels for the eyes. Sirius, also known as the Dog Star in the constellation Canis Major, is the brightest star in the night sky. The bright part of the binary is a blue-white star, 25.4 times as luminous as the Sun. Sirius was known as Sothis to the ancient Egyptians, who knew that it made its first heliacal rising, rose just before sunrise, of the year at around the time of the annual floods were beginning in the Nile Delta. In ancient Rome and Greece, the hottest part of the year was connected with the heliacal rising of the Dog Star, an association that remains in the expression dog days. That Sirius as a binary star was first reported by the German astronomer Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel in 1844. The companion was first seen in 1862 by Alvan Clark, an American astronomer and telescope maker, and came as a complete surprise to astronomers. Sirius B is 10,000 times dimmer than Sirius. Consequently, it's extremely difficult to see from Earth. In fact, astronomers were not able to estimate its mass until 2005, when they were able to use data from the Hubble Space Telescope. From 1931 to 1956, French anthropologist Marcel Gréel and his student Germaine Detelen worked in Mali and lived among the Dogon, mainly by talking to a blind hunter named Ogotemeli. They found that some elements of the tribe's mythology were similar to that of ancient Egypt, especially the importance of Sirius in their traditions. The pair also discovered that the Dogon possessed impressive knowledge of certain aspects of modern astronomy. This knowledge included the belief that the Earth and other planets rotate on their axis and orbit the Sun, that Jupiter possesses 4 moons, and that Saturn is surrounded by a ring. Although this is impressive, such information can be obtained without modern technology, as can be seen by the work of ancient Greek astronomers and Copernicus. But it's not this knowledge that is the source of the controversy surrounding the Dogon. The cause of the debate was the claim that Ogotemeli told the anthropologist that the Dogon believed that Sirius, in their language Sigutolu, has a dark, invisible companion with a 50-year elliptical orbit. This companion is extremely heavy and made of a special metal not found on Earth. In other words, Sirius B. Apparently around 15% of all Dogon adult males were initiated into the Sirius lore. But how could a remote people who lacked any kind of astronomical device obtain such information about an invisible star? Gréel first published this extraordinary data on the Dogon in 1948 and included it in a representation of the Sirius B system drawn by Ogotemeli. One theory to explain the advanced astronomical knowledge of the Dogon was put forward by author Robert Temple in his book The Sirius Mystery, first published in 1976. An advertisement for its second 1998 edition, called The Sirius Mystery, New Scientific Evidence of Alien Contact 5,000 Years Ago, stated Temple's extreme hypothesis about the Dogon and Sirius B. He said, "Convincing evidence that the Egyptian, Sumerian and Dogon civilizations were founded by aliens from the Sirius star system who are now ready to return. New scientific evidence that solidifies the hypothesis that the KGB, CIA and NASA attempted to suppress. An awe-inspiring work of research that calls for a profound reappraisal of our role in the universe." The Sirius Mystery in 1976 set the world abuzz with talk of an extraterrestrial origin to human civilization and triggered a 15-year persecution campaign against Robert Temple by the KGB, CIA and NASA and other government agencies. Undaunted, however, Temple is back with 140 pages of new scientific evidence that makes his hypothesis more compelling than ever. Many authors have speculated on the subject of extraterrestrial contact, but never before has such detailed evidence been presented. Temple applies his in-depth knowledge of ancient history, mythology, Pythagorean physics, chaos theory, and Greek to a close examination of the measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was built to align directly with the star Sirius. He concludes that the alien civilization of Sirius and our own civilization are part of the same harmonic system and are destined to function and resonate together. His findings warrant a profound reappraisal of our role in the universe. Temple's book also states that thousands of years ago an ark descended to the ground with great noise and in a swirling wind and brought amphibious alien beings known as the Nommo to the Dogon. It was these beings who told the tribesmen about Sirius B. The Dogon were also told that the Nommo lived on a planet that orbits another star in the Sirius system. This account follows Dogon mythology fairly closely. In Dogon tradition, Nommo was the creator spirit who emerged with a female twin and several more pairs of Nommo from the cosmic egg Amma. The first Dogon primordial ancestors were thus bisexual water gods created in heaven by Amma and descended from heaven to earth in an ark. Many scientists reacted to Temple's claims by saying that the advanced knowledge about Sirius probably came from Western visitors who discussed astronomy with the Dogon priests. The priests then added this new information to their older traditions. They also pointed out that Grail was an amateur astronomer and could well have used his knowledge to rationalize the rather disorganized Dogon traditions that even tribal members could not agree on. In 1995, two French researchers, Daniel Benest and J.L. Duvent, had an article published in the journal Astronomy and Astrophysics entitled "Is Sirius a Triple Star?", which suggested that there was a small third star in the Sirius system. They believe the star may be a type known as a red dwarf and probably has only about 0.5 the mass of Sirius B. Some researchers have wondered, could this newly discovered star be the home of the Nommo? There are a number of mysteries surrounding ancient Malta, the unknown 6,000-year-old ancient civilization and their mysterious megalithic temples that survived for more than a millennium on the island of Malta collapsed within 2 generations. No one knows why. Recent research has revealed that the sophisticated ancient inhabitants of the island somehow used superacoustics to alter states of consciousness similar to that achieved during meditation at the 5,600-year-old Hal Saflieni hypogeum. Some experts believe that this could be related to the famous Sleeping Lady of Malta, an enigmatic 5,000-year-old statue discovered at the site. Ancient Malta. The Maltese archipelago consists of 5 islands lying in the central Mediterranean Sea, 60 miles south of Sicily. Only 3 of these islands are inhabited: Malta Island, which is the largest, Gozo, and Camino. Malta has a history going back at least 7,000 years, with a wide range of archaeological remains from the megalithic temples and underground chambers of prehistory to the Baroque architecture of the medieval port. As the islands stood at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, a vast array of cultures have left traces on Malta. The most spectacular and enigmatic of the ancient remains on Malta are the Neolithic temples and tombs, built 1,000 years before the pyramids, and the oldest freestanding stone buildings in the world. One of the most fascinating and mysterious of these megalithic structures is known as the Hal Saflieni hypogeum. The Hal Saflieni hypogeum is an underground tomb and complex extending for around 5,380 square feet and is located in the town of Poala in the south of Malta Island. The site was discovered by accident in 1902 when workers digging cisterns for new houses above broke through the roof of one of the chambers. The Hal Saflieni hypogeum consists of a series of oval chambers, halls, and niches set on 3 levels, one underneath the other. The underground structures were all carved out of solid rock in semi-darkness using stone mallets and antler picks, and later smoothed over using flint implements. The upper level of the complex consists of a hollow and central passageway, with burial chambers cut into the natural caves on each side. This is the oldest level of the hypogeum. It was in use from 3600 to 3300 BC. The primary function of the hypogeum site was certainly as a cemetery, as around 7,000 skeletons have been found in the chambers, ranging in date from 3600 to 2500 BC. In other words, spanning the life of the site itself. The incredible amount of human remains is significantly higher than the tombs could have housed at any one period. indicating, along with the dates of the skeletons, that the complex was used for burials over several centuries. Even bearing this fact in mind, however, the high number of burials suggest an unusually large population for a relatively small island. On the middle level, the roughly rectangular oracle room has an elaborately decorated ceiling of ochre-painted spirals and a fascinating side chamber. To amplify and echo a deep human voice. Whether this intriguing effect was intentional or not is difficult to say, though the possibility that these strange acoustics were utilized in religious ceremonies performed in the chambers is an intriguing one. The Sleeping Lady. The famous Sleeping Lady, a 12-centimeter-long reclining terracotta figure with traces of red ochre, was recovered from the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum from a room known as the Snake Pit. Believed to date from around 3000 BC, this corpulent ceramic figure is naked to the waist and wears a fringed skirt. She appears to be in a deep, tranquil sleep on a bed with a rush mattress. One interesting theory regarding the Sleeping Lady, whether goddess or not, is that either in a trance or asleep she may represent a place in the hypogeum where dreams or trance visions were interpreted by priests or priestesses. Such a dark subterranean context would have been ideal for the stimulation of such states as would induce dreams and visions. Fascinatingly, new research may lend support to this theory. Recent discoveries. It was recently revealed that researchers from the Clinical Neurophysiology Unit at the University of Trieste had detected the presence of a strong double resonance frequency. Laboratory testing showed that exposure to these specific resonant frequencies could have a physical effect on human brain activity. What is now the United States up into modern-day Canada. The stone tools found at the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho might give a hint as the origin of the people who settled there approximately 16,000 years ago. The spear points recovered from the region are drastically different to the ubiquitous Clovis points manufactured later on. Whereas Clovis tools have a flaked groove or flute at the base, right at the spot where the point would be fitted onto an arrow shaft or spear handle, the tools discovered at Cooper's Ferry have stems on the bottom where the points attach to the weapon. Even though there are some of these spear points that date from around the same time as the Clovis points, it's obvious that they were made by two very different methods and thus, by extension, made by two differing cultures. The stem method of making projectile points is not at all unique. Examples of similar technology can be found in African and Asian artifacts dating back to 50,000 years ago. However, there are different ways to go about manufacturing such a spear point, and the points discovered in Idaho bear an uncanny resemblance to the points produced in Northeast Asia, specifically on the island of Hokkaido, in what is now Japan. Artifacts from this region span the period from about 13,000 to 16,000 years ago. It's also worth noting that there have also been spear points dating from around 13,500 years ago discovered in East Russia, and though they are also stemmed, they were manufactured in a clearly different style than the examples found at the sites in Hokkaido. This would seem to strengthen the hypothesis. For the next 4 millennia, Malta constantly changed hands, closely following the rise and fall of the great Mediterranean empires. It's not correct to say that the island was completely uninhabited. There is not a very good record, but in principle there was not a substantial population. Recent isotope and trace elements analysis of the bones of the ancient Maltese by a research team led by Carolyn Malone of Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland revealed that they were healthy and generally ate meat or vegetables. The team analysis of ancient soils in Malta pushed back the date for arrival of first inhabitants on the island by 700 years to 5900 BC. DNA analysis carried out on burials revealed that the population came from different parts of the Mediterranean and Europe, including Africa. According to Malone, through radiocarbon dating, we have now been able to pinpoint that the first inhabitants arrived 700 years earlier than was previously thought, and we've also identified several episodes of separate colonization. Given the restricted land space of Malta, it's remarkable that the second colonization survived for 1,500 years. This sort of settlement stability is unheard of in Europe and is impressive in terms of how they were able to live on an ever-degrading land for such a period of time. Other factors may also have been contributed to the decline of ancient Maltese society. DNA evidence indicates the arrival of immigrants from as far away as the Eurasian steppes, which stretch from Hungary to Mongolia and sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps causing population pressure and bringing new diseases. How these immigrants travelled to Malta over such vast distances is still a mystery, however. Researchers believe that the final blow to the ancient Maltese culture was an unknown catastrophic event that occurred around 2350 BC. According to tree ring analysis, this whole region of the Mediterranean suffered a cataclysmic climate event, probably a dust cloud caused by a volcanic eruption. Coincidentally or not, the date of 2350 BC coincides exactly with the cataclysm known as the Middle East Anomaly, a natural disaster of unknown origin, though attributed by some researchers to the impact of a comet or asteroid, which caused extensive wildfires and floods and an air blast of over 100 megatons power. The impact site appears to have been at in Bini Lake in southern Iraq, some distance from Malta, but the disastrous effects of the comet strike may well have reached there. Ancient hominin bones discovered in northern Spain's Atapuerca Mountains have pushed back the arrival of humans in Europe to roughly 1.2 million years ago, around 500,000 years earlier than once believed. Fascinatingly, only about 1/10 of the site's total area has been excavated, which means there may be many more important discoveries in store. One mystery of the site the archaeologists have so far been unable to solve is how the remains of 32 individuals accumulated at the bottom of a narrow cave shaft at the site. The discovery of Atapuerca. Atapuerca is the site of a number of limestone caves near Burgos in northern Spain, known for the abundant fossil record of the earliest human beings in Europe dating back almost 1 million years. The sites at Atapuerca have been known since the end of the 19th century, but it was not until the 1950s that any details of the site became known when the Edelweiss Caving Club, ECC of Burgos, northern Spain, began to catalogue and map Cueva Maya at Atapuerca. In 1962, ECC members reported fossils in the railway cutting to the local authorities. A decade later, the ECC discovered the Gallery of Flint, and in 1976 they located hominid skulls in the Pit of Bones. Paleontologist Emiliano Aguirre began investigating sites at Atapuerca soon afterwards, and in 1978 put together a research project for the first excavations there, which he led until 1991, when he retired and handed over the leadership of the Atapuerca Research Project. Oldest European. In March 2008, it was announced that Spanish paleontologists had unearthed the remains of a 1.2 million-year-old human-like inhabitant of Western Europe in the caves at Atapuerca. According to the researcher, the fossil find demonstrates that members of our genus, Homo, colonized this region far earlier than previously believed. The primitive hominin is represented by a fragment of jawbone bearing a few teeth. Although stone tools of a similar age to the fossil jawbone, from about 1.2 to 1.5 million years old, had previously been discovered in France, Italy and Spain, this is the first verifiable human material of this date. This lends support to the theory that the tools found in the vicinity were made by primitive humans. According to Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London, when combined with the emerging archaeological evidence, it suggests that southern Europe began to be colonized from Western Asia not long after humans had emerged from Africa, something which many of us would have doubted even 5 years ago. The Pit of Bones. One of the sites at Atapuerca, Grandalina, contains human remains which have been dated to about 800,000 years ago, as well as some of the earliest tools ever found in Western Europe. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery at Atapuerca was a cave called the Pit of Bones, where 43 feet down, more than 1,600 human fossils, including several nearly complete skulls, were found. The materials in the pit dates back to between 600,000 and 300,000 years, and represents about 28 individuals whose brain sizes are within the range of both Neanderthals and modern humans. This represents the world's largest collection in any one place of ancient human fossils. Compared to modern humans, these people were short, stocky, and had smaller brains. It has been estimated males were about 5'7" tall and weighed around 170 pounds, whereas females stood around 5'2" and weighed 125 pounds. The skeletons exhibit a number of characteristics unique to Neanderthals, including a projecting midface, long and narrow pubic bones, and thick finger bones. However, unlike later Neanderthals, they do not fully express the characteristic Neanderthal form. The site also contained a 430,000-year-old fractured skull, which has been interpreted as the earliest evidence of interpersonal violence in Homo. Also discovered in the pit were the bones of cave bears. It's believed that the bears fell down the shaft by accident, probably while seeking places to hibernate. But what the human bones were doing there can only be imagined. No signs of tool butchery or other food remains were discovered, and a single stone hand axe was the only tool discovered in the pit, fashioned from a type of stone not known in the area. Researchers have proposed various hypotheses to explain how the fossils got there. According to one theory, the bodies may have been purposely dropped by their relatives in some kind of ritual burial. This would push back the origin of mortuary practices in humans substantially. Thus far, the earliest accepted burials only occur after 130,000 years ago among Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. However, other researchers believe it is more than likely that the bodies were deliberately dropped there after meeting violent ends. The hominins may also have been dragged there by carnivores, carried by floodwaters, or even been trapped after venturing too far. In August 2016, a study of the human remains from the Pit of Bones was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. It identified trauma on 8 skulls from the pit. Part of the abstract of the study reads, "The fractures found in 17 crania from SH display a post-mortem fracturation pattern, which occurred in the dry bone stage and is compatible with collective burial assemblages. Nevertheless, in addition to the post-mortem fractures, 8 crania also display some typical peri-mortem traumas. Interpersonal violence as a cause for the peri-mortem fractures can be confirmed for one of the skulls, cranium 17, and also probable for cranium 5 and cranium 11. For the rest of the crania, although other causes cannot be absolutely ruled out, the violence-related traumas are the most plausible scenario for the peri-mortem fractures. If this hypothesis is confirmed, we could interpret that interpersonal violence was a recurrent behavior in this population from the Middle Pleistocene. It would appear from the results of this study that at least some of those in the pit suffered a violent end at the hands of other members of the population in the area. However, this still doesn't explain how and why the dead bodies were taken into the cave chamber. Perhaps the perpetrators wanted to hide their victims, or maybe relatives interred the corpses in the pit. We shall probably never know for sure. DNA evidence. In December 2013, it was revealed that a thigh bone from the Pit of Bones had yielded 400,000-year-old DNA, by far the oldest human DNA ever sequenced. Previously, the oldest human DNA sequenced came from bones that were less than 120,000 years old. Astonishingly, the results suggested that the thigh bone belonged to a previously unknown human species, which some researchers believe may even be a missing link between Neanderthals and their mysterious cousins, the Denisovans. Paleontologists believe this result brings us nearer than ever before to understanding who our own common ancestor with the Neanderthals was. According to Chris Stringer, the genomes we have up until now are really very recent. This takes us at least a few 100,000 years back towards our common ancestor with other hominins. The researchers had expected the DNA to resemble Neanderthal, but it proved to be quite distinct, most closely resembling that of the mysterious Denisovans, a species known only from a finger bone and 2 teeth discovered in a Siberian cave. Stringer admitted that they were somewhat baffled by this result, and there is no evidence that the Denisovans ranged anywhere near Atapuerca. One possibility considered by the researchers is that the fossils belong to the common ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and some of their descendants later travelled east and became the Denisovans. The genome recovered from the pit of bones is particularly relevant, as it is from a period that is extremely close to the origin of our human line. The archaeological evidence indicates that these early humans were developing important new ways of behaving, though they were still using fairly primitive stone tools like the crafted hand axe, which researchers have nicknamed Excalibur, that was found in the pit. But the bones also suggest more sophisticated traits. One of these traits is the use of the pit as an early burial site, part of a very simple funeral rite. Chris Stringer has even suggested that Excalibur may have been some kind of tribute to the dead. The discovery in the pit of the deformed skull of a girl, who lived to be about 12 years old, also reiterates this more modern behavior, suggesting that the tribe cared for her. There's a hint of something human caring for the disabled, says Stringer. Latest research. In March 2016, a paper was published in the journal Nature, describing a DNA study which, to the surprise of many, identified the remains of the pit bones as Neanderthal. Using this information, the researchers were able to push back the date when the separation between our family branch and that of Neanderthals to sometime between 550,000 and almost 800,000 years ago. In 2019, a comparative study was published of the dental evolution of a number of human species, including the Neanderthals of the pit of bones. These results revealed that the divergence between modern humans and Neanderthals must have occurred at least 800,000 years ago.